there's not that much difference between the LA area and the San Diego area, except for the people who live there.
I've heard that about some other states. A great place to live except for the people, but it is on the hour, a minute or two past. So let's make this official. Happy Saturday and Sunday morning in Australia. Welcome to another Zoom session. We have somebody, we've had a lot of speakers that are repeats, and this week we're fortunate enough to have somebody that's not a repeat speaker, although he's not unaccustomed to speaking. When I started square dancing with traditional and eased into Western when I was out west in California. Never took classes, but I wasn't ever thinking of wanting to be a caller. A lot of people know, oh, that's what I want to do. I thought you had to be born that way until I was forced to do it. But our guest speaker today was born that way. His father was a caller. His grandfather was a caller. It's in his blood. From Hawaii originally, now San Diego, California. I got that figured out. Started calling in 1977, 44 years ago. I used my calculator to figure that one out. Did his first recording in 1982 and has been involved in the recording business in one way or another since then. Now owns several labels and helps make music available to all of us. Happens to be a member of Caller Lab. You can tell by looking at his shirt. And also on the Board of Governors of Caller Lab, and also on the Executive Committee of the Board of Governors of Caller Lab. And I'm sure I left a bunch of things out, but some of you probably know him already. So I will just finish by saying, let's have a big hand for Buddy Weaver. Buddy,
thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to everybody who's here. Thank you for taking the time to jump in here. Don asked me if I would speak on the topic of, he asked me to speak on the topic of music, which is a very broad topic. I said we're going to have to narrow it down a whole bunch. And we arrived at the idea of doing this as a focus on the history of square dance music. And I'm going to actually narrow the focus into more of the history of modern Western square dance music. That represents to me the era from roughly the late 1940s, 1950s forward. This is the period of time where square dancing became more of an extemporaneous type of activity, less getting away from the routines of the traditional dance. And we began to see some more changes happening in the square dance activity at that time as well. These early dances, and we've got some recordings that actually go back to 1950 for the Santa Monica Diamond Jubilee, which actually showed that back in 1950, the callers, even though they were using routines, were beginning to experiment with extemporaneous dancing. Extemporaneous, by the way, we're just going to simply define extemporaneous as the difference between, let's say, traditional versus extemporaneous, where in the traditional sense, the dancers know what is coming. The callers work from a set routine, versus extemporaneous, where the dancers don't know what's coming next. The caller, in many cases, does know what's coming next. Not every single case, but in many cases does know what's coming next. So let's start with 1950. And the square dance music at the time. Square dance music at the time was made up mostly of live music. And as a band piece, maybe about 3 to 5 pieces in there. You'd often find a stand-up bass, guitar, rhythm guitar, piano. Sometimes you'd find a banjo. Sometimes you'd have a fiddle player in there. The typical sound of the 1950s. I've got a sample here to play for you. Let's see if I can pull it up. If it's going to come up easily, probably will not. Bear with me as we get this thing going here. It was set, now it's not. Well, here we go. This is kind of a
offsetting.
Step. There we go. Oh, sorry, kids. I had it, then it went away. I'm having audio problems this morning, apparently.
Buddy, this is why our 20-minute presentations take 45 minutes.
I hate problems like this. This is a recording from a live dance done in 1950 at the Santa Monica Diamond Jubilee, where approximately 15,000 square dancers were in attendance dancing, and 35,000 spectators were present. There were two bands playing on the stage, the California Clippers led by Jack Barber, who is the fiddle player and who is now playing this music. This is typical of the music of the time. You got your banjo, you got your piano, you got a stand-up bass, a little bit of rhythm guitar. This is considered quite a full sound for 1950 live square dance music.
Turn that up a little bit.
Sorry?
You could actually turn that up a little bit for the next sample.
Will do. The musical introduction is actually played for the arrival of Lloyd Pappy Shaw, where they actually had dancers lined up and dancing on the street, and they asked the dancers to part right down the middle of the street so they could bring a brand new 1950 Cadillac convertible right up the middle, which had Lloyd Shaw and his wife, oh gosh, I got hit, Dorothy Shaw, were in the car. They were the unofficial grand marshals to the event. And so that was the band. That was typical kind of music playing back in 1950. You would note that back in those days, 1950s, a lot of your bigger, more popular callers had their own bands that traveled with them to dances. It's been remarked before, and I think Tony Parks, who's here, by the way, I would just want to give a shout out to Tony Parks. His presentations are awesome. I have learned so much from this fellow. And I believe Tony remarked at one point that one of the two of the items two of the shall we say landmarks that happened that led to the growth and expansion of modern Western square dancing was the introduction of cars. People were able to drive around from place to place to get to places, and amplification. I would add the third item to that, and I think the other item that has led to the growth or the expansion of square dancing was the introduction of recorded square dance music. The idea of recordings came around, of square dance music came around the late 1940s. And around that time, everything was produced by the major pop labels that you may not recognize today, like Decca and those. And they were finding that there was a market for square dance recordings. The market was the general public who was hearing more and more about square dancing. It was becoming a phenomenon in American culture. And because there was so much interest in it, it was very showy. It was unique in its sound, and so the pop labels grabbed hold of it. All of the early recordings were done with vocals on it, for the simple reason that the target audience was a general public. And so the caller, the average square dance caller, had very little access to recorded music. There were maybe a handful of recordings at the time. There was not the availability of variable speed turntables at the time, and so everything tended to play very quickly. But then when we got to 1950, it seemed to change within the square dance world. By 1950, you started to see the introduction of square dance or music or labels that were made for square dancing alone. And some of the early labels, like Windsor, for example. Windsor was taken from the family name. This is Doc Allenbaugh out of Southern California, who created the Windsor label. And he went to professional studio musicians, union musicians, and he brought them in the studio to record music for square dancing only. His very first ventures into the recording field were still vocal only. And so if you go back to the original Windsor catalog, you're going to find that all the early releases were vocal only. This was designed for the dancers to dance at home or to introduce square dancing to your friends. So picture yourself in 1950 and you've got your brand new record player, which would have been quite an expensive little item to add to your home use. And you have with that the availability of buying these square dance records and inviting your friends, your family, your neighbors to come over. And hey, we're going to learn square dancing tonight. This is our entertainment. Televisions at home were not a thing. Of course, we didn't have cell phones back in those days, or smartphones, or the internet. And so this was a great form of entertainment. And the square dance recording, the growth of the square dance recording, and let me back up. The introduction of square dance recordings can be tied directly to the growth of the square dance movement. And as the square dance movement grew, so too did the square dance recording industry. By 1950, now you're starting to see these early producers start to make music for callers. And that became a big game changer in square dancing. Because once the labels were producing music for square dance callers, you now were able to become, you weren't, as a caller, having to get a band. And so, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the more popular callers at the time had their own bands. And so those bands were tied up with these callers. So suddenly, you've got every caller has his own band in the form of records. And more records are starting to come out. And so there is a greater variety of music. And the musical variety we're going to talk about ran quite a large spectrum, because the Windsor, for example, the Windsor label, which used studio musicians, ranged all the way back to some of the other labels, let's say like Alomar, which is a very early square dance label, which was started by Al Brundage, where he used his own family as the band in the background, a 4-piece band or 5-piece band playing on a record. And so a lot of the early recordings tended to be on the thin side because they were using the house bands. The other labels that were present at the time, Hoedowner was another label that was out there, and Hoedowner was owned by Cal Golden at the time, and he used his own band that he had out of California. Western Jubilee was another label that came out, and Western Jubilee was using Schroeder's Playboys, a very popular square dance band in and around the Phoenix, Arizona area. Sets in Order was using their own band, which I think was Jack Hawes and Lunette, I can't remember her last name, piano and banjo, and maybe a stand-up bass, and that was pretty much the limit of it. The early square dance records. Sorry?
Sorry, Lunette Brazil.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony. The early square dance recordings were on 78 RPM. These were shellac. These were not vinyl. I've still got a ton of them, and I think everybody here has seen them. I was going to pull one out for show and tell, but I thought, you don't want to see show and tell. These things were packed in metal cases. I've still got the original ones, belong to my grandfather. They are incredibly heavy. They are incredibly brittle. If I remember just setting one down and somebody happened to maybe sit down, and it just shatters just like that. The original square dance 78 shellacs were done with, there's two sides to a record. So for our younger generation, let me introduce you to what a vinyl record is. Records had two sides. And in the early recordings, both sides had a vocal. This is the target market of the dancer, or both sides had music. And so that was a target market of the square dance caller. So if you were buying, if you were a square dancer, you could buy a record which had, let's say, California Here I Come playing on one side with the caller Bruce Johnson, and the flip side could be, Dem Bones by Bruce Johnson. So you're buying a record that has two sides to it, that you can use both sides effectively. And likewise for the caller. If the caller was struggling with the tune, then he'd have to go and buy another record which had the vocal cut on it, so he could actually hear the vocal and learn how to do the singing call. There were some pattern records back in the early days recorded. The square dance recording industry, as it came along, was really focused more on, if they did hoedowns, it was hoedown music, not a lot of called hoedowns. There were McGregor in their early 78 RPM record days was doing one side with a called patter and the other side had a called with a singing call. And so the complementary, the part numbers, for example, might be like a McGregor 1001, and then you might see a McGregor 2001. The 1001 would have been two sides vocal, and 2001 would have been both sides music. The phenomenon that kicked in with the square dance, introduction of square dance labels, was the idea of, there's two things. Number one, we found the idea that we could have classics, because at that point, there were no classics. It was, everything was played by a house band, and you were limited to what the house band could do. But now suddenly we introduced ourselves to square dance recordings. Some of your early classics, for example, was on Sets in Order, a thing called Little Red Wagon, where everybody seemed to gravitate towards it. It became very popular, and the more popular it became, the more it sold. In the days of 78 RPM shellac, an average pressing was right around 5,000 to 10,000 on the very first press. And not so familiar with how they did repressings back in the old 78 days, but it was not uncommon to do a first pressing at 10,000 because it was going to be too expensive to go back and do a repressing, if at all that was available. Other types of classics that we were introduced to was the idea of like the Auctioneer on Blue Star, and Light in the Window, which is on Western Jubilee. We also got the idea that something that was brand new to the whole world was that we had what we called the recording caller, the staff caller. No one had ever seen that before, and certainly in the square dance world, that was never ever heard of. So you began to see some of the bigger name traveling callers become recording artists. The recording labels wanted the traveling callers because, let's say I'm Doc, well, let's use Doc Allenbaugh as an example. Doc Allenbaugh, who started Windsor Records, right away grabbed some of the bigger name callers from the area, people like Robbie Robertson from the Seattle area, who was very popular within the Pacific Northwest. He traveled a bunch, and by having him as a recording artist, now that meant that more people would pick up that record because they knew who he was. It gave rise to the idea that you could have a new fellow, a new talent, let's say, or a new female talent come into the field, and as their popularity grew, then so too did their record sales. So he would marry, for example, Windsor brought in Bruce Johnson. Bruce Johnson was a very young fellow back at the time, and he was beginning to get his name known nationally. He was doing a lot of traveling. He came across very well on records, and well, I'll touch on that kind of towards the end of my presentation. But because he was a traveling name, and it was a good match for them. And when you think about it, you can look back historically and see how a caller and a label got together and how they worked well for each other. And a good example of that is going to be Marshall Flippo and Blue Star Music. Blue Star Records at the time was a very well-known label. It had a good following, and Marshall Flippo was a beginning, he was not a beginning caller, but he was beginning to travel. And his name was starting to grab. People across the nation were beginning to hear about who he was. And so the more he traveled, the more he recorded. And the more he recorded, the more he traveled. And it was great for Blue Star, and it was great for Marshall Flippo. That's something we don't really see too much anymore, but it was unusual for the time on being able to have that kind of marriage between a singing star and the label, big reputations. I'll touch on this briefly just because I made notes on this. It said Windsor Records had their big traveling stars when they first started out was Bruce Johnson, Al Brundage, Don Armstrong, and Robbie Robertson. Sets in Order had their big traveling names as Arnie Cronenberger, Frank Lane, Lee Helzel, and Johnny LeClaire. McGregor, back in the 1950s, had Bob Van Antwerp, Jonesy, and Jerry Helton. These guys were the big names in square dancing. When you went to a national convention, they were the names that you immediately gravitated to when you saw big festivals going on. These were the guys who were doing the festivals, and they were out there, and they were selling their records. The other factor that came in, the item that comes into play with the introduction of square dance recordings, is that really gave round dancing a start. Because if you go back to the early days, just before we had recordings, there were only a handful of round dances. You would have things like Black Hawk Waltz, and all of the rounds were memorized at the time. There were no such things as round dance cuers. Everybody learned the dances, and the orchestra would play the Black Hawk Waltz, and you get up and you dance it, or the Varsouvienne. Same thing. Everybody knew what to do, and it came on. Now you've got square dance records, and they're square dance record companies, and they're starting to produce round dances. Some of the very early round dances, I'll go back to Windsor again, was a thing called Waltz of the Bells. And here it is, full orchestra, beautiful piece of music, well recorded, good dance, and suddenly now people who liked round dancing were able to find more than just the same old 4 round dances. And the square dance labels were no fools. They could see the growing popularity of round dancing, and they kept feeding more and more and more dances into the supply chain. And there were more choreographers coming out of the woodwork, people who could write a dance, let's say, no matter where they lived, in San Diego, a small little town like San Diego, and have a big hit round dance like Happy Polka. Suddenly that was now, for example, Happy Polka, I was told, had sold upwards of about 100,000 copies on one record alone. That made it one of, and I believe that makes it to this very day, still one of the most popular and largest selling round dance records. If you look at it from between 1950 and the introduction of Waltz of the Bells through 1964, in that 14-year period, round dancing exploded. And it was all thanks to the recording industry and having to have records. Early dances had music on both sides, and then later on the iteration came along of putting a cure on the flip side of it, which leads me now to the idea of recording methods. Because if you look at the recording quality, and now the music we played in here, and I'll give you some samples here in just a second too. A lot of the early recording quality, the quality of the recordings, I should say, for its time was good, but by today's standards is poor. So let's go back to 1950 for a second, and you're recording a 78 RPM shellac. And this comes to me firsthand from Les Gocher. Les Gocher was a friend of mine, and Les Gocher was one of the very early recording callers who began recording for C.P. McGregor. C.P. McGregor Company was known in the country as a transcription company. That was their claim to fame. And they found this idea that they could sell square dance records and make more money, so they brought in Les Gocher, who recorded the 78 RPM albums. A 78 RPM album was a 5-record set. So each record had 2 sides. One side had one cut, flip side had the other cut. And that way you could get 10 cuts in an album. And if you can imagine the weight of 5 of these 78 shellac records being put in these albums, that was an album. And that's where for example, Les got involved with the recording industry. He told me the story that back in those days when the recording was done, there was no recording tape. There was no tape as a media. And so everything was recorded, cut live onto discs, like wax discs. And so he would be in the studio, and they've got a square of dancers that he's calling to in the studio in a different room. That way he can keep his timing. And the orchestra is playing either in behind him on a different set of mics or in a different room. And you could call right along, and at the very end, he'd make a mistake. They'd stop, cut, they would take the wax disc, they'd lift it off the platter, they'd smash it, and throw it into a garbage can in the studio, where all of these broken pieces of discs were collected. And they had to smash it because they wanted to make sure there was no chance that would ever be made into a record, the mistake. And he said, they'd start the recording process, and he's calling along, and they'd say, cut, take the platter off, smash it, what's the problem? He said, we have this thumping noise going on in the background. Thump, thump, thump. We can't figure it out. They figured it out. It was him. It was Les Gocher patting his foot so hard in the studio that it was smacking and resonating through the microphone. So they had to bring in a piece of carpet, put carpet underneath him. That fixed the problem. go back. We're now on take 5. He's kicking along. You get to the very end of his vocal cut. One of the musicians hits a bad note. Cut. Take it. Smash the platter. Take 6. On we go. After the entire process was done, the caller and the dancers left, and the band had to make their own set of records. The same music had to be played. And so if you listen to some of the old 78 RPMs, especially where there's a call side and a music side attached to it, it would not be uncommon to hear the music is played completely different or even slightly different than the call side, because they weren't done at the same time. It was impossible to do it. Now you kick ahead to 1960, and we've got the introduction of recording media like tape. And so now the band is able to go ahead and lay the whole track out. And when they laid the track out back in 1960, the cutting edge technology would have been to put microphones around the room. It was not something where they could mic an instrument. And I've got tapes sitting here, reel-to-reel tapes in my studio that go back to 1964, where you have 2 tracks. It is stereo. And on one track, you've got probably the guitar, you've got the stand-up bass. And those 2 are playing chords. And then here's the other track, and there's your fiddle player and your pianist, and they're playing the leads. That's the melody part of it, and that was how they mixed it. If the bass player hit something funny, everything stopped. Everything started from the beginning all over again. And so it's not uncommon to have the same piece of music that I've got on these reel-to-reel tapes done 4 or 5 times. Take 1, take 2, and you listen to it, and I'll listen to the back-to-back and think, I don't hear the difference until you finally hear, oh wait, I hear the piano player hit a funny key back there. That's why they had to redo it. That began the idea of recording technology changing in 1960. When 1960 came along, you've got more square dance labels, you've got more recording stars, you've got more musical variety, and the kind of variety that's starting to come into it. So let's talk the kind of music that was out there at the time. A lot of the early square dance recordings were I call them the sing-along classics. That's stuff from the 1920s. That's the California, Here I Come, Sitting on Top of the World, that generation. Everything that right now falls within public domain because it has aged out of the system. By the 1960s, now some of the labels are starting to grab hold of pop music, the stuff that's being played on the radio, and say, you know what, I think we can turn this into square dancing. And the cutting edge of that was a label named Wagon Wheel. And Wagon Wheel was owned by Don Franklin, and this guy was smart. I think you can look back at it from the in the rearview mirror and say, here's a guy that brought together 4 or 5 callers, and all of these callers were well traveled. You had Jerry Haig, Burl Main, Ken Bauer, and Gary Shoemake, along with Don Franklin, 5 of the quote biggest names in square dancing. They were all young. They were all good looking. They were all well-dressed. They were all great callers. They had a great following within their own area, and they'd come into town. They'd play the kind of music that you would hear on the radio, and the music for its time may not have been the greatest kind of music at all. Hang on just a second. I'll get you a little sample here if I could. It may not have been the best music you've ever heard in your entire life, but it was very good for its time. Let's see if this is going to play here. This is typical wagon wheel music. And this would have been cutting edge into the late 1960s and early I would say middle 1960s into the late 1960s. They're miking the room. You can hear stand-up bass. You've got a clarinet. You've got a banjo in the background. You've got rhythm guitar. you've got a tune named Long Lonesome Highway, which is a pop tune back at the time. I believe Ken Bauer is credited as being the first one. Well, and that's not really a good. I'm gonna back up on the claim. The claim was that he was the first one to bring a pop record into a square dance idea with using an Elvis Presley tune as a square dance. But I think you can go back even further than that. I think you go back to the 1950s when you had Dick Ledger do Mary Ann as one of the very first pop pieces that made it into a square dance. Hey, I'm going to move on. I'm going to try to wrap this up now. We're going into the 1960s now. We've got a change of musical style. We've got a change of musical genre. We've got the introduction of 33 1/3 RPM albums. And for anybody old enough to remember those things, those were the big lightweight albums. And friends, that also in no small way played a large part in the expansion of square dancing. And the way that it worked is that a caller, let's say Marshall Flippo, for example, would grab hold of a brand new call, swing through. In 1964, ocean wave calls were brand new to square dancing. So if you're a dancer now, imagine there were no ocean waves. If you did a do-si-do to an ocean wave, it was only to balance and then do a right and a left through. There were no calls like swing through, there were no circulates, there were no trades. In 1964, this was brand new stuff, and it started to gain attention on a national level, and it spread by putting this stuff on 33 1/3 albums. Because now everybody could hear how to do a swing through, how to do a circulate, and all of a sudden everybody was buying albums. This again led to the expansion of the record label. Marshall Flippo stands out in my mind because he is the holder. No one has recorded, absolutely no one in this business has recorded more albums than Flippo did. He had done more albums in his day than anyone. Now, our boom period went right into the 1970s with square dance records. Square dance records. Now, they were still purchased by the general public, so a lot of the callers would take their brand new records out. I'm going to play for you a quick representation of how the music has changed here over the years. I'm going to start with 1964 and what was considered the biggest and most popular tune of its time in '64. Here's your banjo, your stand-up bass. This is a 4/4 shuffle rhythm. The bass player is hitting about every other step that you're doing, and it sounds slow, but trust me, it dances fast. That's Summer Sounds. That would have been McGregor, biggest seller in 1964. You flash ahead into the early 1970s. This would have been about 1974, 1972. You could tell the music style has changed. Now we're getting more of a symphonic sound because you've got xylophone playing, you've got a clarinet playing, you've got a very strong, very good piano player in there. You've added percussion from drums that wasn't present in the earlier cuts. This is First Thing Every Morning, and this was a big hit back in the 1972-74 time period. Flash ahead into the late 70s. And you've got the red boot sound started to take hold. Tempo picks up. There's a strong bottom to this. When we talk about the bottom in music, we're talking about the danceability of it. There's something on the bottom to actually step your foot to. The bass player is playing boom, 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 boom. Quite strong. It's quite out there. The chords are strong. The melody is there, but not necessarily taking precedence all the way through it. That would have been Thinking of a Rendezvous on Red Boot. 1976, you would have had the biggest song of the time. These were professional musicians out of Nashville, led by Johnny LeGimble, who was a Grammy-winning artist in his day and age, who brought the musicians together. This would have been Chaparral Records, Rockin' and Rosalie's Boat. It was also starting to mark a turn in how music was recorded, because now you're getting every instrument individually mic'd. You're also getting to have a different change in sound. This goes ahead now to 1977. And this would have been one of the bigger sellers for 1977 and on. The instrumental is played by a fellow named Del Casher. Del Casher was a protege of Les Paul from the Les Paul era. Very talented guitarist. Using musicians from California. And I'm going to flash ahead a little bit just to kind of give you an idea. I'm going to play for you just a little sample. I'm going to jump a little bit around here. Forgive me. And I want to show you how square dancing music has evolved since I've just got done playing for you what was some of the big stuff at the time to what some of the new stuff coming down the turnpike sounds like. This is the evolution of square dance music. The name of the tune is Chattanooga Choo Choo. That's actually a brand new cut that we did in our studio in Nashville. The way we do music now is so different from even back in the 1990s and 2000s. We have the ability to mic individual instruments. We may have the same musician come back in and play multiple instruments, layering the sound. We have the ability to change the EQ on each individual instrument. We have the ability to compress it if it gets too hot or too soft. We have the ability to add things like reverb to each individual piece. We have the ability to mix. We introduce things in modern music like kick drum, which was not a big thing. No one added kick drum, and I know Daryl Clendenin's on here somewhere. No one added kick drum to their music back in the 1990s and 2000s. Kick drum is a relatively modern iteration, and a lot of it is due in no small part to the fact that pop music uses a lot of that. Today's music labels have really captured a great variety of music. And I do believe that I'm going to close my presentation by telling you the bad part and the good part. The bad part of what's happened to the square dance recording industry is started in the 1980s when the manufacturers of home stereos stopped including record players. Once record players stopped becoming a household item, that was the end of the square dance music era and its heyday. Because up until that point, we had so many sales. When I first started out in the 2000s, our first pressing on a record still was 2,500 records. That was a lot of records, and it wasn't that uncommon to turn around and get requests for represses, which meant that we were going back and getting more. In 2003, vinyl records represented approximately 95% of all sales. So if you put out a brand new song, let's say your brand new song was Chattanooga Choo Choo in 2003, 95% of the sales were going to be in vinyl records. Another roughly maybe 7% was going to be CDs, and the remaining 3% would have been sales through MP3s. By contrast, today 100% is MP3 sales, and that's happened in less than 20 years. So think about that just for a second. In less than 20 years, we have seen the death of vinyl, and we have seen the birth of the MP3 business. We've seen the birth of internet sales, which did not exist back in even 20 years ago. That kind of leads me to the end of my presentation, which is the future. And I think the future looks good because we actually have that opportunity now through the internet to be able to sell music directly to a buying public. The buying public is obviously smaller, but even having said that, I think the product that we have today is so much more superior, is so far superior to what we had even 20 years ago. And for that reason, I always advocate for folks to buy new music. If somebody were to say to me, "Oh, buddy, I heard your Chattanooga Choo Choo, but listen, I've got an old version of it on Windsor Records from 1950. I think I'm going to go back and use that version." Oh, please don't. Trust me, your dancers want one thing. They want a dance beat. If they can't dance, they're not going to enjoy themselves, bottom line. And that's the one main feature that a lot of us as music producers today place as the number one item on our checklist is a dance beat. If you can't step to the music, then the dancers are going to struggle. And what's the point? Why do we need to have dancers struggling? And so on that note, I'm going to say thank you for letting me speak today. I hope I didn't bore you too much. I'm on mute.
I think, wow, buddy, that was a great presentation. Very interesting. You talk about, because I've been calling for a while, I'm still, one of the few records I still use is one of the Wagon Wheels, Rambling Man. A lot of good memories came up with the stuff you played. Anybody else? Well, we usually do this a little, well, I'm confused here.
Let's chat for a moment. So I've got a question kind of, and this may be more in Tony's wheelhouse than Buddy's, but it seems as though, we've got 3 minutes and 42 seconds for a singing call, and that's remarkably close to how much you can fit on a 45 RPM record. How did the recording technology influence square dancing and vice versa around the time when 45s were the big thing?
Buddy, do you want to go first? No? Okay.
Take it, Tony.
Okay. Oh, we're still getting an echo. Oh, now we're not. Okay. Yeah, I think recording technology did influence the format, the structure of square dances, particularly singing calls, but also to some extent patter calls. And that is that in the days of 78s, there were two general sizes that the public bought and that square dance callers and square dancers bought: the 10-inch and the 12-inch. The 10-inch were a lot easier to handle. The 12-inch were the size of the 33, the LP albums that a lot of us remember, but they were heavier and they were much more fragile. So callers and dancers didn't like to handle them. Dealers didn't like to send them across the country because half of them would break in shipping. So the 10-inch size was a lot more popular. And in the old days, in the 40s, going into the early 50s, the most you could get on a 10-inch side was about 3.5 minutes, 3 3/4 minutes. So before the days of recordings, it was common for a call, either a singing call or a patter call, to be figure break, figure break, figure break. They would call a break after each couple's turn, or after the heads would go once, then they'd call a break, then the heads would go again, they'd call a break, sides break, sides break. And you couldn't do that on a 10-inch record. You had to go up to 12-inch. And a couple of the labels, Windsor and McGregor, I know, did some of these. They issued some 12-inch records, but they weren't as popular. So I think that's when it became the custom to call an opener and then call either the first and second couples out, or if it was a change partner singing call the heads out twice before you called your middle break, and then you would call the figure 2 more times, and then you would have a closing break. That was 7 times through a typical tune, and that was easy to get on a 10-inch record. So yeah, when the 45s came out, at first they were generally the same length as a 10-inch record. They did have extended play. That's where the term EP comes from. That's still in use. And you could get 5 or 6 minutes on a side, but the grooves were very thin, very fine, and the kind of equipment that you used at a dance, you could make mincemeat of a record like that. A new definition for hash records. You could make hash of your records by, if you used LPs or EPs at a public dance. Oh, there goes. Buddy must have muted himself.
Yeah, I was going to add on to what Tony was saying too. Is it more echo now than it was before?
When we
You're
talk,
not, yeah, you're not echoing, by the way.
Everybody else is echoing. I'll mute after I say. To add on to what Tony was saying, the idea of when you're shredding a record and stuff like that, when music has to get pressed onto a vinyl record, so the processing, the process is that it goes from a master tape, used to go from what we call the father to the mother to the stamper, and then the stamper is what pressed onto the vinyl, the little vinyl bits and pieces. And so it went through a number of processes. Now, when it goes onto a vinyl record, it's got to be, the sound has got to be re-EQ'd so that the grooves, it will allow for the needle to go through it. All of the original Hilton audio products had 89T type record needles in it. 89T needles were notoriously fat needles. And the reason why they went to that is because they were more durable, so that the caller could drop it, snag it, whatever it was, and the needle didn't necessarily break. The problem was when you put fat needles on a player, you have to have fat grooves. In order to get fat grooves, you need to lose your biggest bass and your biggest treble. Both of those have got to come back down to the middle to create a fat groove. When I was very early on in this business, I used a pressing plant, was Universal, part of the Universal Studios outfit out of upstate New York. And we had a fellow up here in Los Angeles who's cutting my the lacquers for me. And I said, we've got some beautiful new music. Let's cut it onto vinyl. We did it. It was beautiful. It sounded great. And at the time, I was using like a 300C or something like that, maybe a 205. And so the needles were very fine and would play through it. And it wasn't more than about 2 months after that record was released, I started getting phone calls from the record dealers complaining that people were the callers are sending their records back saying the record doesn't work. The needle keeps skipping. And it was because there was too much bass and too much treble. The sound was too refined. And so we had to re-EQ the whole thing, recut a whole new lacquer with fat grooves so you could drive a Buick through it. And that's where we lost everything in that regard. And that's why anybody who takes a record and puts it onto the computer is making a huge mistake. It is like taking a color picture, making a copy of it into black and white, which is what a vinyl record is, and then making a copy of that and trying to turn it back into color, which is what you're doing when you're putting it onto your computer. It's folly. It is better to go back to the producer and see if they've got the original studio master, which in many cases we do, and we're able to re-EQ it. And that's what I did. As soon as we stopped selling vinyl, we re-EQ'd everything. I'll close by saying, Tony, we were, something that came up recently was I found my very first amplifier, and attached to the tone arm is a nickel. It's taped onto it. And I was reminded of things like the records when you'd put the needle on and go, and so what did we do? We used to put nickels on. I can remember putting a silver dollar on one just to make it sit down there and drive that needle right through the groove. Didn't know at the time it was just because that record had great fidelity, and it was just a lousy needle in a great record.
That was the other trouble with the 89Ts. They required a lot of pressure to track properly. So yeah, the Hiltons, up until the last few models, when they got away from the 89T, the older ones, it was what, 6 or 8 grams of pressure on the needle, where a home hi-fi unit would be like 1 gram or less.
I wanted to throw in, just in case people were wondering, Buddy mentioned EQs very frequently. That means the equalizer, where you can adjust the amplitude of various, lows, highs, middle, whatever it needs to pull it up and make it sound okay. Daryl, you had your hand waving for a while ago.
Yeah, it was long enough ago that I probably, now I remember what it was. When you were talking about the length of the records, particularly on 45 pressings, there was a price break at 4 minutes. If you went over 4 minutes, you paid more for the pressings, which always made me kind of wonder about Bob Osgood with the sets in order and his 5-minute hoedowns. Yeah, there was a reason for the 4 minutes. And of course, that tended to kind of work into what Tony was saying, this 7 times through, the opener, the figure twice, middle break, everything fit in there. And it fit nicely and easily. Early on with the 45 pressings, it wasn't unusual to have, instead of 7 times 64 beats, have 72 beat figures. Something like a riverboat on Grin, I believe it was. And it took advantage of some things that we miss out on today when they have to adjust to the 64 beat form. Sometimes they have to cut out part of what made the record, or the original record, very popular. It's another story.
I was noting to myself, Buddy, that as you were talking about in the 40s and 50s and how the record industry changed the evolution of things, I had always heard that part of the popularity and what have you was the advent of better PA systems, and you could do more than just yell to your own square, but reach more and more squares. I suspect that's in parallel, but what you said about music availability, etc., really makes a lot of sense to me. That was great to add that to it. Speak, somebody. Ask a question.
Whoops. I'm going to mute Tony because I was getting a little bit of feedback from him. So I tossed this in the comments, but just in terms of the evolution of where the bass drum came in and the drum kits, I was listening to Cocaine and Rhinestones recently, which is a history of country music. And one of the things that Tyler comments about in that is that back in the 50s, the existence of a drum kit on a recording instantly made it pop, rather than country. So it was a while for drum kits to come into country music, and I'm wondering how that tracks. Although, for Buddy's example, the drum kits were in country way earlier than they made it into square dance music.
The early square dance labels, the drums seemed to be the option, and it seemed to be the expensive option. I'll give you the example. The record label, which is Melton Luttrell, so this is Square L, and he was producing this back in the early 60s up until 1964, and he kept the tapes, and he gave the tapes over to me. And so I was able to remaster the tapes, and one of the first things I did was I called him up and said, "Hey, Milton, you didn't pay for a drummer, did you?" And he said, "We couldn't afford a drummer." And I said, well, I'll tell you what, you've got a drummer now, because by putting everything up into a visual onto the screen, I can see where every bass note is hit. And by adding a track of kick drum and snare, I'm able to then match it beat to beat to beat. So, and it takes a long time, because even when there was a drummer in the old days, it might not have been a prominent thing. And one thing I've noticed is that it depends. I knew which band was playing, because when you throw the audio up into a visual display, and you can see he's he's speeding up and he's slowing down. He had a rough night the night before, and he may have just come crawling into the studio that morning, and he is not keeping time very well. We can still fix it, but God bless America, it can be difficult. But that's the other beauty of modern technology, is we're able to add percussion to pieces that didn't have the percussion before. Did that to quite a few of our pieces, and I think it makes it a much better product. Going forward, I could tell you that you could listen to that particular song on what we've done with an MP3 versus what it was done like originally on a record. There's no comparison.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of, well, I saw Daryl raising his hand, but I was also thinking history of tempo, because you mentioned the speeding up and slowing down when they recorded without click tracks.
I hope I'm unmuted. Okay. Yeah, buddy, before I say anything else, very, very nice presentation. I'll tell you what, I learned a lot of stuff that surprised me, which always happens when Tony makes a presentation as well. Thank you both for your histories. One thing I will say about the music, now I started late in the music as far as the square dance music. It was mid 70s. And the music since then, I've really enjoyed. When they had the multi-tracking and the overdubbing, the production of it, it added so much. But at the same time, it lost something. Some of my favorite music was Frank Messina and the Mavericks, which was done on McGregor, and it was done a live microphone. Now, there's no comparison between having a live feel to the music to the multi-track systems that are used today. It just had something special to it. So if you can get a chance to get a hold of some of that older music, where they were using live instruments and all played at the same time, rather than, okay, we're going to put the banjo on this track, we're going to put the piano on that track, the drums track, da 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 da. This is just all open microphone. It had a feeling to it. Well, that shut things up real quick, didn't it?
Who else have we got out there?
I was going to add one more thing to what Daryl was saying too, that with the ability to even so, we get tracks in today, and sometimes the tracks will come in from a studio, and everything is kicking along, everything's in sync, but you've got one musician who is just not with it, and the engineer didn't catch it. And that's okay. We've got a recording of it. I can still, if I've got a lazy piano player, I can still put it up onto a screen and cut that and move that piano player to where he should be, and make it and make lemon. I guess making lemonade out of lemons is what it amounts to, rather than having to go back to the studio and re-record the whole thing.
I remember going in the studio at 6 or 7 o'clock of the evening after work, and not getting out of the studio until 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock the next morning. Just sitting there. Of course, when we started working in the business, we used drums. And you're right, it was the drummer usually that gave us the most problem because he was speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, so we had to go over and over and over again. Yeah, it took all night to do a full session of music, but yeah, things are different these days. And that's
Hey,
a good
Daryl,
thing.
I wanted to tell you, I remember those days when we would leave a dance and go off to the studio and do our all night sessions. And so,
Yeah.
this would have been about 2 years ago, this just before we got into COVID shutdown. My buddy calls me up and he says, we both need to get in the studio. We both need to get some vocals done, and we're going to do our harmonies. And he said, you're going to be calling up in LA on this night. He said, I'm going to come to your dance at the end, and let's just go straight in the studio and get it all done. We should get done in about 2 hours. I said, it's kind of late. I'm older now. He said, no, it's going to be great. Going to be great. We got in that studio at 11 p.m. and we left that studio at 5 a.m. And I said to him, I said, why did I let you talk me into this? I mean, this was great when we were in our 20s, but I haven't seen my 20s for a long time. And it's not fun because now I have to drive through rush hour traffic that's trying to go to work in the morning. Last time I let my buddy talk me into going to a studio after a dance.
Tony, I was just wondering, most of what you do these days is, contras and traditional squares with live music. Does any of that ever get recorded? I know you've done a few things like Kitchen Junket, but do any of the contra people now use recorded and MP3s, and how does that work? Clark, I know you and I forgot her name.
Lisa.
Lisa,
Green.
yeah, doing they're it's not, it's not a regular thing. It's not intended to replace live music, but every now and then they do a contra dance to recorded music. Clark can tell you more about it than I can, but basically it's pop music that's spliced to be the right number of measures for contras. But as I say, it's not a nobody is suggesting that we start contra dancing to recorded music as a regular thing.
I was laughing when Buddy was saying, I forgot, two guys doing the rhythm, drum, and the bass, and the piano, and something else doing the melody. And the one contra dance I called for you on a Sunday, the rhythm was you on piano. But piano can be either side of the story. It was.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think more often it's rhythm, especially on the traditional side. In the Northeast, in particular, there's a long tradition of, the fiddle is the melody instrument as usual, but in the Northeast, there's a long tradition of the piano being the rhythm and harmony instrument. I think that's because the Northeast was settled by Europeans before the rest of the country. The East Coast, the whole East Coast, but in the Northeast in particular, you have the towns are all close together, and every town had a town hall and some churches, and every hall had a piano. It was it was just the logical thing to use. Whereas on the trek westward, you wanted small, portable, repairable instruments like the fiddle and the guitar.
I want to do my usual on the hour, I know it's a few minutes past, thing about thanking Dan for the technical end of this, thanking you guys for coming, a big hand for Buddy on the presentation. I thought was great, and I'm really glad that this stuff is being recorded and made available, because I think a lot of people would love to hear what Buddy and Tony were bouncing back and forth about the history of this stuff and what have you. And we didn't have nearly as many people here as we frequently do for a variety of reasons. But for posterity, I think this is going to be good stuff to have to have on vinyl, to have on
Right. Hopefully, somebody 50 years from now will be interested in what we were doing.
If they'll still have MP3 and MP4 players
If
available.
they'll have a way to access it, yeah.
So
Well, there are still cylinder players around for the cylinders that predated the 78s.
Um,
let me
but
give an answer, Don, before
yeah, I
you
was going to
move
say,
on.
let's, now that we've done the formal part, let's continue as long as you guys want to stay. Go
We
for it.
Tony didn't really get to answer your question, so I'm going to answer it, and he can correct me because I'll just make stuff up. So there's contradance musicians, and sometimes they get together and form bands with names, and they feel pretty constrained in what they can play at a contradance due to tempo and tune selection, etc. And sometimes they put out CDs of their music, and sometimes their CDs are selections like what they would play at a dance, and sometimes it's other music that they can play together that maybe wouldn't be appropriate for dancing, but they want people to hear, their sound and their creativity.
Yeah.
Occasionally there'll be special CDs put out that have longer and dance length and dance tempo tracks, with the intention that if someone needed it, they really could and would dance to it. But I think it's rare to find a lot of music that's put out especially suitable for contra dancing that people then buy and use for contra dancing, because the live music tradition is so strong.
Yeah, that's changed a little bit in the last 20, 30 years. At the beginning of the Contra revival in the 70s, there was I think there was a feeling among the musicians in particular that if they recorded dance length cuts, then people would start using them for contra dancing the way people had gone over to recorded music for square dancing in the 50s and 60s. And I think that attitude has softened in recent years because I'm seeing a lot more recordings that are dance length, 7, 8, 9, 10 times through 32 bars or 64 beats. I'm just finishing up my book on calling traditional squares, and I'm working on the resources section. And I'm really impressed at how much music there is out there that's usable for contras and for old time squares, especially the Southern string band kind of music, where if you're doing a Southern big circle dance, you want it to run for 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 minutes. And there are now tracks being released that are longer.
Buddy, that sounds like a new business you could get into. Producing some of their music.
I appreciate the thought. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, and thank you very much for having me in.
Great to have you.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Yes. Cool.
One of the things that Buddy brought up was the idea of the record skipping. If I can share a story that's true. Once upon a time, they had a festival in British Columbia, Canada. It was the Penticton Peach Festival. Came up every fall, and that was back in 1976, 77, and that particular time period. At least it was after Wagon Wheel was well into producing music. But they had a huge open air festival there. They lay down wood floor on King Field that would hold probably 150, 200 squares outdoors. And they built this big tower for a stage that they would put the caller up in to call to this mass of humanity out there. And you had a music monitor over your head, and the fellow that was putting the needle on the record was down on the ground controlling all of the sound and everything. Cecil was his name. Well, it was my turn to get up there and call, and I got up in there, and Cecil put the record on, and I was doing my singing call on Chaparral, which was Bloody Red Baron on Wagon Wheel. And every time it hit those drums, that record would skip, the needle would skip. I think Cecil was probably drinking coffee when it was happening, not paying much attention, whatever. But I came down off he never did reset the record. Nothing ever happened. I climbed down off from this high stage just in time to hear some gal that was one of the dancers. Yeah, he did it good, but he didn't do it like the record. I had to adjust my choreography and everything every time it skipped, because it didn't skip very far, just enough that it messed up back then what was the memorized pattern that went to that record. Today, callers everywhere, they just kind of freewheel it when it goes through those figures anyway. To get the same figure 4 times in a row through a record these days is kind of unusual, isn't it? But that's the end of my story. True story.
I'm reminded of a true story, just since nobody's talking on subject much, but before I could afford a Hilton, I had put something else together, and it wasn't very well spring loaded. So it took a nickel or a quarter on top of the needle. But one of the tricks that I found to keep the needle from jumping was to put my setup on something as sturdy as possible. I remember once calling with it on a grand piano because that seemed to work pretty well. And I was doing a party night for Outing Club. It was a little more than party club, but in a big old lodge. And I looked at one end of the building, and there was this huge rock fireplace and what do you call the hearth, the part that sticks out onto the floor, this
Yeah, the hearth.
solid big rock thing. And I said I should set up on that because that's going to be fine. And then I noticed that it was 2 halls sort of separated in the middle with a big arch, and I know that sound doesn't travel past that very well. So I chose to set up there and aim a speaker at each hall and not on the hearth. Well, it turns out halfway through the dance, all the bouncing on the floor and everything, and the hearth came through and fell down 6 feet onto the ground below it. The whole rock structure just fell, and all I could think of was, oh my God, I was almost set up on that, and I would have gone down with it.
That takes me back to my childhood and dancing at summer camp in the dining hall that had a hearth, and sometimes we used records like in between the squares. We would play Salty Dog Rag or an international folk dance, and we learned that we had to put the turntable on a bench on the hearth and not have it touching the wooden stage because it would skip right away.
You're lucky the hearth didn't fall through.
Yeah, really.
A memory I have that, fortunately, I'd wiped out for a long time.
Yeah. I'm sorry Buddy had to leave because I had 3 points I wanted to make while he was still around, but of course I can tell him about them. I can email him. Points that are on topic. One of them, I think, a major turning point in the development of modern square dancing happened in the very early 1950s. Up until then, square dance records were almost entirely made of existing material, dances that had been written and had been called in public probably many times by different callers before somebody thought of putting them on a record, because the whole idea of square dance records that you could actually dance to was new. So naturally, people scrambled to find all the good dances out there and put them all on record. And the turning point came, I'd say, somewhere between 1950 and 1955, when they ran out of existing dances, and callers started writing dances specifically to make records. A traveling caller would think of a song that hadn't been used yet for a singing square. He would either write choreography, or he would get a friend who was good at it to write choreography for it, and then he would test it on his touring. He would have maybe have a dub made of it with just 2 or 3 musicians, and he would use that. Or if he was lucky enough to have his own band, he would use the band. But he would try the choreography out on his dancers wherever he went, and that's how a lot of the singing squares came to be. That they didn't exist until a record company asked for them. And some people blamed the proliferation of new dances on this whole economic phenomenon of they had used all the existing dances, but they didn't want to the companies didn't want to close up shop. They wanted new ways to make money, new titles to make money on. So they would actually solicit new dances. And I think that happened with the round dances too. Once they exhausted all the traditional couple dances that were out there. And if nobody else is speaking, I'll go on to my second point, which is that there's a widespread belief. I've seen it written down in square dance histories a lot, that live musicians back in the 50s priced themselves out of the market, and that's why everybody went to records. And if the musicians did hike up their rates at that point, I think it was because they were having less and less fun playing for dances, because the caller was the big cheese, and it got to where the dancers didn't know what was coming. The callers were improvising or pretending to improvise, but not telling the dancers what was coming next. So they had to the dancers really had to hear the callers. So they would turn the music volume down on the PA system, and they would turn the caller's volume up. And of course, the caller would be standing out front and getting all the applause. And for the musicians, it was just another job. They weren't having as much fun. They couldn't throw in variations. They couldn't improvise themselves as much as they would if they were playing a concert. They had to keep a steady beat and not get too flashy, so as not to interfere with the caller. So it was less fun. They were getting less recognition. So, I have a saying, a lot of callers do, for love or money, when I'm taking gigs. If the money's, if the big money's not there, then I'd better be pretty sure I can enjoy myself at the gig. And if I know it's going to be a horror show, then I charge accordingly. So the musicians were saying, we're not loving it, so let's take the money instead. And so if they raise their rates, I'm sure that's why. And my third thing, which I really wanted to battle.
Tony, I want to throw in a comment on that last thing. I
Oh,
never thought
okay.
of it that way. But when in later years, when I got excited about dancing contras as well as calling Western, one of the ways I used to describe the differences is that in contras, the emphasis is on the music and the musicians, and in Western, the emphasis is on the caller. And that sort of plays right into what you were just saying, that the caller
Sure.
became the emphasis.
Yeah, and in modern contra dancing, dancers look to see who the band is going to be more than the caller when they decide whether to go that week or not.
And the caller does a lot of prompting so that the music will come through.
Yeah, and the ultimate goal of the caller in present day contra dancing is to stop calling entirely. 3, 4, 5, 6 times through the routine, and then the caller shuts up, and for another 10 or 12 times through, the dancers are dancing to the music, because it's anywhere from 4 to 12 different calls repeated over and over and over. And so it's pretty easy to memorize, especially when you've been doing them with your body. So yeah, it's a whole different dynamic.
And when I started contra dancing at your dances, it took me probably 3 or 4 weeks before I could start appreciating music. There was enough difference in the sociability of it and the, the slightly difference in choreography, but um, it just, I didn't realize that I was supposed to be appreciating the music. Of course, once that evolved, and it did take 2 or 3 weeks,
Sure.
why then it was amazing. But
Hmm. Yeah, you get different things out of it.
yeah.
Like quickly, my last point, and I'm really sorry that Buddy's not still here, is the price of tracks. Um, that I don't know if anybody, if callers are complaining about this, but I've noticed that new square dance, like a new singing call, will be $7 to $10 now. And of course, for that you get the instrumental, you get the called version. Sometimes you get multiple keys or with and without harmony singers. But still, $7 to $10 for one song may seem excessive to some people. And I'm looking back to the '50s when tracks were about 50 cents each. They if you bought a 45 for $1, that would be a track on each side. If you bought an LP for $4, $5, $6, that would be 12 tracks. So the going rate for tracks was about 50 cents. So now it should be at least $5 a track with inflation on everything else. But it's only $1 a track if you're buying downloads of pop music. So I think that the $7 to $10 that the square dance producers are charging is a lot more reasonable than expecting people to. A lot of my musician friends are complaining because tracks are only $1 a piece and they're only getting a few cents if it's on Spotify or some such. A lot of contra dance musicians and traditional musicians in general are still putting out CDs and selling them off the stage at their gigs because it's a nice package for people to take home, and they're making some real money on it as opposed to downloads.
The one thing that Buddy didn't mention, I was thinking about, we talked about different forms of platters evolving to, but the evolution, I think it went to CDs and then mini discs and now MP3s. So the question is, what's next? What's coming on the horizon?
Uh-huh.
Technology will tell us, I guess.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine an improvement on MP3s in terms of convenience, in terms of no matter what brand of computer you have, you can use them. But we may see an improvement yet.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts on that, but I have not had the time to implement a demonstration of what I've got bouncing around in my head.
Well, that's a topic for another Saturday. You could probably do an hour on that.
Yeah.
How many squares will fit in your head?
Lots.
Well, I'm seeing a dwindling in conversation here, so I think it's about time that I bow out. As I said earlier, I'm really glad that this has been recorded, and I think we should talk it up in the places where the announcements usually are, that people should go back and listen to the recordings, because I think there was some really good stuff brought up that may not be important to people, but is the kind of thing that after 55 years of calling, I was unaware of some of it, and I find it very interesting, and it's a good thing to have put down.
And 2 notes related to that.
Yeah.
I need to buy some more drive storage so that I can store some of the original recordings of these rather than simply uploading them to YouTube. But that can quickly become digital pack rattery. So if there's a way we can, I don't know if Barry Clasper or somebody else would be interested in kind of figuring out how to move these things along further. And what was my other thing on that topic? I had another thing, but that was the primary.
Yeah, I'm sure Barry has links to this, but that's only links to it. It's not preserving the actual item.
And it depends upon YouTube being around, and I'm not an all my eggs in one basket kind of person.
I've been kind of wondering about all the stuff I've got on YouTube that's not public for the mental image classes I've been doing. Yeah, boy, are they doing a service to me. But that's, not there forever, I guess.
Yeah.
Tony, was it you or somebody talking about that their discs still available to play the old meter? Um, the book that I wrote is still available on digital, but it's on rolls of tape this big and about this thick, and there are no machines that I could find to read that anymore. So when I did reprinting, it was strictly scanning the pages. Although I think I'm going to be doing some OCRing of them because there's been some interest in translations to other languages.
When we got my Contra book back into print, the original files were in an obsolete format, and we had to get a friend to convert them.
Yeah, I don't have any friends that have reel-to-reel readers like that. The MIT labs where they were done, or I don't think have them anymore. Technology has changed, and it's been fun following it.
Slightly off topic, but when I was putting together my bibliography for my new book, I was astounded at how many of the old books and pamphlets have been uploaded and are now free for the reading. So anybody who's interested in square dance history, like pre-1960, or the kind of material that was being done from 1940 to 1960, or even going back to the 1400s, the centuries before the ancestors of square dancing. It's all there on the web.
And two good places to look are the historyproject.org. Is that what it's called?
Squaredancehistory.org.
Squaredancehistory.org. And the Square Dance Foundation of New England,
SDFNE.org.
Yeah, has a lot of good stuff also.
Yeah, so. I'll have all the URLs in the book. I would love to do an online version of the book where all the URLs are live links, but I haven't figured out how to copy protect it.
That's
because this is my life's work here, and I give away a lot, and I'm when it's one to one with fellow callers, I'll give them just about everything I've got, but the whole thing as a package, I want my few bucks for.
Fully understood. That's why I haven't made a digital copy of Out of Sight available either, just because I don't know how to. I want to get the information out, and I want to cover expenses, but I just don't want to throw it away, kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Not yet, anyway. Someday, maybe. There's a silence. I think I know what that means. As I was saying a few minutes ago, I think I'm going to bow out. Thank you guys again. And
yeah, thank you for facilitating these, you and Dan for hosting these so that we can hear all these different guys and gals.
And my hardest part is getting around to thinking of people that want to give presentations, or people not realizing they need invitations. But if you have other things you want to share, Tony, in any way, please feel free to. Hannah, if you want to tell us more about Swedish history, that would be cool sometime. I don't know if you're the right one, but you're our most regular attendee here.
Yeah, I would like, I would love to hear more about how modern square dancing got to be so big in Sweden. Maybe not right now. I gotta go. It's lunchtime for me.
The discussion we had a few weeks ago about how it got so big in Australia was fascinating.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I really wish I could get Brian to lead a group. He says, no, I like participating, but as far as leading, I like to be face to face. So that's not going to work. But yeah, it's fascinating how Americans think it's an American thing and that's it, you know. Why? I hear it just got to Australia 60 years ago.
Well, that's like my friend David Millstone, who's a contra caller, calling in California and having someone. Maybe he wasn't calling, maybe he was just attending a dance, because I think it was somebody who didn't know who he was. Explained to him that contra dancing was invented in California in the 1970s.
You mean
that's like the people at Dartmouth College think that they invented Salty Dog Rag in sometime in the 60s, when it was actually a Danish schottish that was put to the pop record in 1952.
That's probably still the only round dance I can do. With that,
Yeah.
let's see, we still have 1, 2, 3, 4 countries represented out of the 6.
Wow.
That's pretty cool. 3 continents. Anyway, I've tried to say this before. I'm checking out, guys.
Yeah.
If you have any,
Been virtual.
don't need a total invitation to do a presentation. Just contact me if you've got an idea. We do have somebody for the next week, and we have, I think, 2 weeks off because I'm going away, unless, Dan, you want to lead something. We haven't talked about that yet. We usually don't get around to talking about it till the Wednesday before, unlike Mel Wilkerson, who is smart enough to plan weeks in advance. But
I think we can probably drop back to about once a month or so. I mean, I realize we lose momentum with that, but we also have lives now.
oh,
Getting there. I had a couple of weddings.
Cool.
Well ventilated.
You got married again? No.
So you're all free over in America, is that right?
No, well, we're still masked or all of the dancers in my area are still dancing masked and fully vaccinated, checking vaccination. But my Thursday night club has decided to not start up with masks, so they're going, and I've probably lost my Monday night club just because in that time period people moved, people retired, everything changed. So
we opened up briefly at the start of the year for mask wearers, and it was very hard to get people to actually wear masks anywhere, on the dance floor, off the dance floor.
I called one dance masked, and I was doing okay with my headset and my mic inside the mask until my batteries in my headset transmitter died. And I'll wait for it to all blow over before I get back into it.
Yeah, I actually backed out of an indoor wedding. The organizer was the host was not happy about that, but I found another caller for her. At the last wedding I did, they tested everybody, and they wouldn't let them pass the front lawn of the house until it was one of those 15-minute tests. So you had to wait to stand around on the lawn until the test showed negative.
Mm-hmm.
Is Melbourne still in lockdown? I know that was sort of the center of where things were relocking down again, but that was months or so
We've been in and out of lockdown since, I want to say, June, and it's been sort of 3 weeks on, and then we had 1 week where we came out, and then we were on for about 2 months, and then we were out for another couple of weeks, and now we've been back in for about 3 months. We had our Freedom Day day before yesterday now, which was Friday. But I'm a healthcare worker and a staff member. We've just made it through the whole pandemic, and a staff member tested positive on Friday. So everyone else gets Freedom Weekend except for me. It's devastating, but hopefully it's a false alarm and everything's.
And that's why you're sitting at home at 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning.
3:30 now, yeah. No, I've been meaning to jump on for a while, and it's just either it's clashed or it's gotten to about midnight, and I've gone, I'm not going to make the distance.
Yeah, cool.
Well, I'm glad. Well, welcome aboard. It's nice to see a new face here.
I've been meaning to come on for a while. It's just haven't.
Yeah.
But normally we do have almost always Mel is on, Mel Wilkerson and Brian very frequently. So since neither of them could make it today, thank you for representing Australia.
I don't know Mel very well, but I know Brian very well. He's quite famous in our parts.
Well, he's also, I think, lives closer to Melbourne than
Oh yeah, he's New South Wales. Yeah.
Plus,
I don't know where Mel's. Yeah.
Plus, he's in Brian is from Australia, whereas Mel is a transplant from Canada. So, but he's made himself very public on Zoom and added an awful lot too. And with that,
all right, yeah.
I think it might be bedtime.
Yep.
Yeah, see you, folks.
Cool. Bye all. See you next time.
session, guys. See you.
Bye,
Everybody.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.